Good afternoon. My project is on Stand in the Schoolhouse Door, and I'm Jonathan Gamble, and this is my grandfather, Charles Gamble. Who am I? I'm a student at the University of Alabama. I'm currently in this African American Studies class. Who's my guest? My guest is my grandfather, Charles Gamble. And the reason I chose this topic was because my grandfather was watching this situation unfold before his eyes in 1963 as a student here at the University of Alabama in Farrell Hall. Background: on May 17th, 1954, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down its decision in Brown versus Board of Education, which stated that education of black children in separate public schools from their white counterparts violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, thus meaning the University of Alabama had to be desegregated. Following this ruling, numerous African Americans applied to the university but were denied. The university even went as far as working with the police to be able to find disqualifying qualities of these candidates, and when they failed to do that, they would quite literally intimidate the applicants to the point where they did not want to attend. The Stand in the Schoolhouse Door took place at the Foster's Auditorium at the University of Alabama on June 11th, 1963. This was where two African Americans, including Vivian Malone and James Hood, applied to join the newly desegregated university. The federal judge at the time, who was Sayborn H. Lynn, ordered that they be admitted, and that George Wallace, the governor of Alabama at the time, could not interfere with the admission, but still granted him access to the campus. Upon Vivian Malone and James Hood's arrival to Foster Auditorium, George Wallace stood at the front door of the auditorium as if he were to block the African American students from going in. This was to keep the governor's promise of segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. Anticipating the uproar this would cause, President Kennedy issued Executive Order 11111, which federalized the Alabama National Guard, and Guard General of the time, Henry V. Graham, then commanded Wallace to step aside. Wallace would then eventually step aside and let these two students complete their registration into the university. The magnitude of this event. This event drew widespread media attention both nationally and internationally, bringing the issue of racial segregation in the United States to the forefront of the public's attention. This event helped motivate support for the civil rights movement and increased pressure on policymakers to enact further reforms. The aftershock of this event. In the days following the enactment, the National Guard remained stationed on the campus due to a significant presence of the Ku Klux Klan in the surrounding areas. Tensions escalated as Wallace and Kennedy exchanged heated telegrams regarding the situation. Wallace objected to Kennedy's decision to keep the guard on campus, placing responsibility on Kennedy if anything were to occur. Kennedy, in response, pointed out the Executive Order 11111 clearly stated that the state troopers under Wallace's control were responsible for maintaining police, and offered to revoke the order if assurances were given. Wallace refused, asserting that he wouldn't be intimidated, and claimed that he was unaware of Executive Order 11111. This event marked the beginning of school desegregation in the state of Alabama and helped the state move past its tainted history of racism and segregation. These are two photos of George Wallace and police officers standing in front of Foster Auditorium. It's just kind of being intimidating to the black students who were trying to register. So I have 4 questions, and this is where my grandfather's going to come in. The first question is, who are you and what did you do for a living?
My name is Charles Gamble. I was born in Hueytown, Alabama in 1942. So I'm 81 years old. I came to the University of Alabama to go to law school. And when I arrived on campus, the law school was located on the edge of the quad at the University of Alabama in what is now called Farrah, F-A-R-R-A-H Hall, which was the law school for decades. The name Farrah was the name of the real formative dean of the law school who built the building and raised the money. And Dean Farrell had been the first dean at Stetson Law School, which was the first law school in Florida. And then he had been dean at the University of Florida before he came to the University of Alabama. Today I am a dean emeritus of the University of Alabama Law School. I began as dean in 1982. I ended my deanship of the law school here in 1987. And between then and 2005, I was a chaired professor teaching in the law school subjects of torts and evidence. I had taught many other subjects before that, but that was my assignment at the end. I have written a number of books used by Alabama lawyers pretty widely on the subject of evidence. Today I live on campus. I'm retired and live at Capstone Village, which is directly across the street from the student rec center that was the first rec center on the campus.
All righty, next question. What were your personal experiences being here and watching all this unfold before your eyes, especially being on the University of Alabama's campus?
Well, it was like being on the edge of the road and two people pull up and start fighting in front of you. It was quite spellbinding. I was in the foyer of the Farrah Hall. There is a round staircase. I was on the second floor looking out of there's a very large window there that faces Foster Hall, Foster Auditorium. You'll hear many designations of what that was, whether it was a gymnasium, whether it was Foster Hall, exactly what it was. Well, it was the only facility on school grounds that not only you had basketball games, girls and men's, you had it served as an auditorium on campus for the largest auditorium. There was no Coleman Coliseum at those days, and it was the home of the physical education department. There were offices in there, and today it would be considered a very small facility, but it was used for political speeches. I would hear George Wallace a number of years later speak at Foster Auditorium.
All right. Did this whole experience feel surreal to you? Or was it just like it just was an everyday thing? Because I mean, you were living.
Oh no. We had studied Brown v. Board of Education, which was the Supreme Court case in which the Supreme Court held that it would violate equal protection to continue to exclude Black students from participating in white schools. Up to that point, George Wallace's position had been that it was constitutional to segregate schools as long as they were separate and equal. In fact, it was called the separate and equal doctrine. But the United States Supreme Court, correctly so, said that doesn't fly because you look at the two systems, the white system of education and the Black system of education, and the state simply was not giving near the money to the Black system as it was to the white system. So the idea of being separate but equal just didn't work. And so this was a very controversial decision. And people in the South basically just sort of went nuts over it. And they did everything they could in the South not to implement that decision. And they didn't implement it for years. until finally Kennedy, President Robert Kennedy, decided to enforce what law there was, which was Brown v. Board, and to begin working on the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And so the first step in this process was to integrate schools in Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. And we were not the first, nor was it the worst here. In Mississippi, they had like 16,000 federal troops, where in Alabama they had only 1,000. And in Arkansas, it was very violent. And here, at least you could say for George Wallace, there was not a lot you could say, but one thing you could say in support of George Wallace is that he told the people of Alabama, we should not have violence. But he, on his inauguration, he had said that, quote, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever, close quote. And he was here at the University of Alabama to keep the two students that had applied and were ready to register, Vivian Malone and James Hood. And the reason they were at Foster Auditorium was because that was where you had to go to register. Prior to the advent of large-scale computers, people went to Coleman Coliseum in recent years, but then you went to this mass situation in Foster Auditorium, and so they had to register before they could go to classes. So that's how the two of them ended up going in the door of Foster Auditorium. And that afforded Wallace the opportunity to stop them at the door of Foster Auditorium, which would furnish the name of this incident in the schoolhouse door forever. And people nationwide know what you mean when you say stand in the schoolhouse door. And what happened was that in order to get this done without violence, John Kennedy, who was president, had his brother, who was the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, who I might add, Robert's son is now running for president in 2024. But anyway, and ultimately both John Kennedy and his brother, Robert Kennedy, would be assassinated before real equal rights come to Black people. It took just decades for that to happen. And anyway, the president, under the law of the nation, if it is necessary to quell violence in the country, the president has two alternatives. One is that he could send in federal troops. The other is that he could federalize the state guard, a National Guard, which is normally under the governor, but he could take it away from the governor's supervision and make them, in essence, federal troops. That's what he did. And if you look at the photographs you showed, if you'll, can you flip to that for me? Yes, you notice that Wallace is in front of two different people. And on your right, as you look at these pictures, the first person he stood in front of was the general who was in charge of the National Guard, and who was now, instead of working for Wallace, by the National Federation federalizing guardsmen, worked now for John F. Kennedy, who was president. And so he stepped, and Malone and Hood were behind him to get past Wallace. Wallace made a first speech there. The general decided not to push him away, not to push him aside. And so that ended, and I'm watching this. And then several hours later, they come back again, the students who had to register, and they were with the man in the second picture, the one on your left, who is partially bald. He's got his arms folded, and he is a man named Katzenbach, Katzenback, who was the chief assistant to Robert Kennedy, who was the attorney general. And he makes a statement standing in front of Wallace, not where he is in that photograph, but he tells Wallace that he's there, he's representing the president, he's there to enforce the decision of the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, you got to realize that when the Supreme Court of this country lays down a rule of law, they don't have any troops or anybody to enforce what they say. That enforcement has to come through the attorney general via the president of the United States. So Katzenbach tells him that we're here, we're implementing Brown v. Board, you must step aside and let us in. And he then steps aside and folds his arms very politely. And Wallace then made his speech, the speech of the stand in the schoolhouse doors, explaining that the whole basis of his position was states' rights, that the federal government doesn't hold all the rights, that the state has rights. Then he stepped aside. So this doesn't show him really stepping aside, but he did. The podium was then moved, and then Katzenbach led the two students, along with some administrators at the University of Alabama, and they later that day, the students went to class, and it was a dramatic event in my life and in the life of the University of Alabama.
All right, the final question I have is, what steps can we take to ensure that accurate and inclusive narratives of Black history are more widely disseminated and understood in educational settings and society as a large? And being a professor yourself, what do you think about this? Because you would probably know or have a little bit of.
Well, growing up in the Kennedy era and supporting President Kennedy, and being, as you well know, Jonathan, a historic Democrat, I was empathetic with this movement because we must find a way to give full and equal rights to all of our citizens, and of course that includes citizens in Alabama that constitute 30 or 40% of our population. And so I have to say that I was very sympathetic to this. I think today, in many ways, there are people who want to prevent white students from understanding what Blacks went through in this country in order to gain what rights they finally got under the Civil Rights Act.
Yes,
which
sir.
Ultimately passed after Robert Kennedy died, and who started it, and then Lyndon Johnson, President Lyndon Johnson, upon the assassination, took over and did what people thought could never be done. And the reason he was able to do it was because he was so persuasive, and he took under his arm the primary senator of Georgia, and who was a staunch segregationist, and told him this was something you have to do. It's something you ought to do. And today, people they do not want Black history to be in the public schools. They don't want kids to know anything about what it has.
That's what I was just about to talk about, was how Alabama Governor Kay Ivey just signed a bill into law on April 20th, this is law known as SB 129, which prohibits public schools and universities from maintaining or funding diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. So we talked about this in class, how that could possibly wipe away the whole, how that could possibly wipe away the whole African American studies class we're in right now. Do you think we're going back? Do you think we're stepping back? Like, do you think we're moving forward with our Black history and like desegregation and racism, or do you think we're moving forward?
Well, I think there are two different things. One is, are we going backwards in both affording rights, full citizenship rights to all Americans, and is there racism? To me, are joined issues, but they're somewhat different. First of all, clearly, it is objectively provable we're going backwards in terms of the law. The Supreme Court has just held, or a few weeks ago, that we can no longer give any credit in admission to the law school to the fact that you are from a race that has historically been enslaved and kept from its full potential. All right. So that means there are going to be fewer, except at the historic Black schools, there are going to be fewer and fewer Black lawyers to serve the Black community and to promote the interests of Blacks. So I think racism, to me, is only going to be settled as an issue when American people realize that it is a matter of the heart, that we must begin in terms of rights and ultimately in terms of our own sight to see no difference in people. Excuse me. You may see the difference, but it shouldn't make any difference. We claim to be, in this state, the center of the Bible Belt. And yet, when the New Testament says, in Christ there is no difference between man and woman, Greek or Gentile, and there are no respecter of persons, that we are all in God's sight equal. Until people are willing to embrace that concept, which they teach every Sunday, then we're going to have a continued backward movement. I mean, an example of what I'm talking about is what has happened to the critical race theory in this country. Critical race theory was simply the concept that we must realistically go back and teach what happened during particularly post-Civil War to Blacks in this country. For example, one of the first books I ever read was a book by a former slave who graphically explained in the book how that it was against the law to teach your Black child to read. And otherwise, you might get hung. You might get, whipped. Therefore, in my judgment, we're going to have to educate ourselves on where these beautiful people have come from, and that they're as much a part of our nation as ourselves.
Yes, sir. I agree with that. All right, we're going to wrap this up. Conclusion. I want to thank you for listening, the teacher, to this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. It has been an honor to be in this class and learn all about African American history and their fight for equality that's still going on today. I want to thank my grandfather, Charles, the guests, for his continued support throughout my college experience, and especially for doing this for me. It's an honor to have you as a guest, and even more of an honor to have you as my grandfather. The stand in the schoolhouse door will forever be remembered not only through history, but also through the new Vivian Malone Plaza located right in between Foster Auditorium and Farrell Hall. These are my references, and thank you.